All right, good evening, everyone. It's reached 6 o'clock here in Kyoto, so I think we'll get started. All right, welcome to the 125th International ARC Seminar, our 11th of the current academic year. My name is Travis Seifman. I'm the research manager here at the Art Research Center. Today, we have the honor and the privilege of welcoming back Dr. Ellis Tinios, honorary lecturer, University of Leeds in the UK, and ARC visiting researcher. So if I recall correctly, and we should have confirmed before the event started, but if I remember correctly, I believe we may have met for the first time around the same time that I had my first interactions with Akama Sensei and the ARC at the Smithsonian.
Right.
When I was an intern helping to digitize the Pulverer collection of Japanese books over there. And Dr. Tinios visited the Freer Sackler that summer and spoke with us about the books. Over the years, I've had the pleasure of hearing him speak on a number of occasions, and it's always fascinating to hear about his discoveries and insights into the design and production of early modern Japanese books. Dr. Tinios has had a close relationship with the center for many years, and it's my understanding that he's been presenting in the seminar series quite regularly for quite a few years. So it's a pleasure to have him here again today. So, and yes, and before we start, I also wanted to welcome Dr. Hannah Osborne and Matsubo Ryoko from University of East Anglia and their students who we've unfortunately having some trouble entering the Zoom, but hopefully they'll be able to join us as soon as possible. And we'll be having sort of a separate discussion with them afterwards. So I would like to try to end our regular Q&A session as promptly as possible by 7:30. So without further ado, the title of today's talk is Hokusai the Alchemist, an exploration of sources for his book illustrations.
Right. Thank you very much for your introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be back and have the opportunity to present my thoughts to an audience like this one. Now, Hokusai is praised for the inventiveness and the variety of his work. What has received less attention has been his visual sources and how he's manipulated them. So over the last 20 years, in lectures and seminars and in publications, I have explored books illustrated by Katsushika Hokusai. From time to time, I mention that Hokusai sometimes used compositions by other artists as starting points for his own book illustrations. This evening, I will examine more systematically the ways Hokusai took very ordinary book illustrations by other artists and turned them into fresh and exciting designs. Hokusai's capacity to do this, to take very ordinary book illustrations by other artists and use them as the basis for fresh new designs, is the reason I call him an alchemist, one who could turn lead into gold. I will also consider the models for Hokusai's most distinctive book layouts, and I will conclude with some generalizations about Hokusai as an artist and book illustrator. I would like to begin with antecedents. I would like to consider the models for Hokusai's most widely known book, Hokusai Manga. As you can see here, it was a major publishing undertaking. It spanned 64 years and ran to 15 volumes. Now, it may be Hokusai's most widely known book. However, in the popular mind, it is often misunderstood. But today, I will not look at the ways in which Hokusai Manga have been misunderstood. That's a big subject for another day. Now, the outstanding feature of the Hokusai Manga is the presentation of multiple elements on each page. As you can see in this random selection of spreads, most pages in the manga are covered with numerous small illustrations depicting every variety of human figures, objects made by man, ranging from small tools to entire buildings, plants of all kinds, all animals, birds, fish, and insects, and landscapes of every variety. Basically, Hokusai included all under heaven in his manga volumes. And if you're interested, I recommend that you go to the ARC's book image database, where you can peruse all 15 volumes of the Hokusai manga from cover to cover and in many different printings and states. So the artist Kitao Masayoshi accused Hokusai of plagiarizing the format of the Hokusai manga from his own Ryakugashiki books. As reported by Kitamura Inte in his Kansei Nen Kanhiji, Masayoshi complained that Hokusai was always imitating others. He never created anything. Masayoshi said that this was the case with the Hokusai manga too, and he believed that Hokusai was simply copying the concept of the manga from his Ryakugashiki series. Now, what was the Ryakugashiki series? Here we can see 7 very handsome volumes produced between 1794 and 1813. And we have, first of all, volumes devoted to human figures. There's the delightful Choju Ryakugashiki, which was devoted to animals. And then we had a Sansui Ryakugashiki, which also in his own way is a remarkable book. And finally, he ended the series with Soga Ryakugashiki, a very impressive book devoted to the representation of plants. Now, please note that these Ryakugashiki volumes are in Ohon size, and the Hokusai manga are in Hanshibon size, and I have them to scale in this slide for you. Now, the folios, or cho, used in Hanshibon are only 70% of the size of the folios used for Ohon. Since paper was the single most expensive component in the production of Edo period books, reducing a book from Ohon to Hanshibon saved 30% in terms of the amount of paper required. That meant you could sell it more cheaply. You hoped you could sell more copies and therefore increase your profits. This was from the publisher's point of view. But for the artist, it also meant that perhaps the books would be more affordable to a wider audience. And that was certainly one of Hokusai's concerns. Now, let's compare, because this is a serious allegation. He's saying Hokusai simply copied the idea from me. So let's just have a look. I'll compare a few spreads. So on the top, we have the Masayoshi, and on the bottom, we have Hokusai. And here we have Jimbutsu. And I wish we could just sit and go through these books page by page in the comparison, but all I can do is select a few here for you to see. And I'm going to try not to rush you through them. But we do need to move on. So let's see here. Some more devoted to human figures, but here they're working, or they're transporting things. These glimpses of daily life that's fascinating in these. Very ordinary scenes are being depicted. Now, of course, that's another huge topic for another day. It was really quite revealing to me when I started making direct comparisons between the two books. And then finally, plants. So in all genres, we can see very close similarities in these books. It does look like Masayoshi had a case. As I say, there's a great deal of similarity in the general appearance and the feel of his volumes and the feel and appearance of the Hokusai manga. Both artists were actually doing the same thing. Now, it's possible to understand Masayoshi's annoyance. He believed his intellectual property had been stolen by Hokusai. Now, please excuse me for using this anachronistic term, but I think it is useful to use intellectual property in this context. It may have been, he thought, his intellectual property, but was he justified? Can such a format be considered something you could copyright, you could claim exclusive right to? Now, as far as I'm able to determine, Masayoshi was the first Japanese artist to use this format for an entire book. He first explored it in 2 mihiraki, or spreads, in his Shoshoku e Kagami of 1794, which was printed in line only, as you can see here. And but the rest of the Ryakugashiki books were printed in line with 2 light colors, as we see here, except for the landscape and the plant volumes, which were published in the boneless manner, That means there were no outlines, just areas of color in them. Now, Masayoshi had to have known the 18th century Chinese painting manual, Kaishien Gaden. It circulated in Japan in the 18th century, and it had pages like these in it. Now, these pages provide a clear precedent to the two Mihidaki in Shoshoku Ekagami, as well as the other Ryakugashiki books that followed. And we also find boneless printing in color without key block in Kaishien Gaden as well. So should we now accuse Masayoshi of plagiarizing the Chinese imports? Because he was not averse to borrowing. This is the first spread in his Ryakugashiki, which is devoted to human figures. And this is lifted from an imported Dutch drawing manual. So artists are always working with designs of others. Why was he so touchy that he felt he had to attack Hokusai? It seems very likely, if not certain, that Kaishien Gaden provided the inspiration for Masayoshi's Ryakugashiki series. But the relevant pages in the Chinese books lack the density, animation, and variety we find in Masayoshi's books. Masayoshi took this format to a new level of complexity. And Masayoshi's books were popular. Some, but not all of them, went through many printings into the 20th century. However, as a group, they did not achieve the fame, the mass appeal, and the wide circulation of the Hokusai manga. When we compare spreads from Hokusai manga with spreads from Masayoshi's Ryakugashiki, we immediately detect differences. Masayoshi's designs are suave and fluent, but they lack the precision, imagination, meticulous detail characterized of Hokusai's book illustrations. And I believe that it was these features, this precision in rendering, the meticulous detail, and that wild imagination that really boosted the appeal of Hokusai's books. First, to the domestic market in Japan, and then to American and European tourists and collectors. Also, we have to bring into the equation the fact that Hokusai's books were aggressively marketed by Tohekido, that is Eirakuya Toshiro, who was based in Nagoya, and later by Unsodo, who still works in Kyoto today. And the Unsodo Kura is full of the printing blocks for Hokusai's books, and they're still dragging them out and printing dreadful copies of the manga, Fugaku Hyake, and other books. But that's not for today this evening. Sorry, that's a small digression. Now, were there other, and here we are, again, to compare more closely, what I see as the differences between the Hokusai books and the Masayoshi books. In Masayoshi, you get a kind of continuous fluidity that after a while may become a little monotonous, whereas Hokusai is always giving us some fresh take on what he's depicting. Now, the only other Japanese antecedents to Hokusai manga that I've identified are Bunpo Soga, which was published in Nagoya in 1800, and Bunpo Kanga, which was published in Kyoto in 1803. And again, it's very likely Hokusai would have known about these books, that these might have had some influence on the manga as well. Now, this is quite interesting. The extent of Masayoshi's sensitivity to other artists encroaching on his territory is revealed in an incident relating to Bunpo Soga. And I thank Christian Dunkel for bringing this incident to my attention and for sharing the paper he presented in 2022 at an EAJS panel on the concepts of copyright in the Edo period. It seems that after Bunpo Soga was published in Nagoya in 1800, Masayoshi's publisher Suzambo in Edo filed a formal complaint in Edo and Osaka against Fugetsudo, that's Fugetsu Magosuke, the publisher of Bunpo Soga, who happened to be in Nagoya. The complaint was that Bunpo Soga fringed on what I've already described as Masayoshi's intellectual property rights, meaning the Ryakugashiki format. Fugetsudo was ordered to stop selling the books, and the firm did. even though it remained in business for a very long time. And in the past, I was surprised, why did Fugetsudo stop selling the book? And what we find is that in some, sorry, this is a close-up of the Bunpo Soga, but what we find in some copies of Bunpo Soga, very fine early printings of the book. On the kanki, the colophon page, as you can see here, there is a red stamp that's been impressed onto the page, and that reads Chofu Eirakudoshi. That means that it was Eirakudo Tohekido Eirakuya Toshiro, who was the holder of the blocks now. These copies of the book were already printed and bound, so all he could do was add this stamp to say, I'm now owning the book. So he took over the printed copies that Fugetsudo had in stock, as well as the printing blocks of this problematic book. It was not until 14 years later that he actually used the blocks to start printing his own edition of the book. And here is the recut colophon sheet. So what he did was he took out the left-hand side of the block, and with umeki put in his name and address. Say, this is my book. And also he added a third printing block for color. So you can see he added, can you see my arrow? He added the stripes, for example, here. He added color there. He added color there. You know, he tried to enhance it a bit. So in 1815, he was selling this as a fresh book of his own. And he omitted to put any date in the colophon. Right. So he didn't want to admit that it was already 15 years old, the book that he was printing. Now, as Christian Dunkel points out, the scholar Kishi Masahiro suggests that the attack on Fugetsudo was part of a campaign by Kamigata and Edo publishers against the Nagoya Honya Nakama, the Guild of Publishers that had been established in Nagoya in 1794. In all, Kishi found 43 cases brought against the Nagoya publishers between 1794 and 1839. This was based on his analysis of the documents of the Kyoto and Osaka publishing guilds. And he argues that immediately after the official recognition of the Nagoya Honya Nakama, which the guilds in Kyoto, Osaka, and Edo opposed, those guilds joined forces to suppress or hinder Nagoya's standalone publishing activities by blocking sales of disputed publications. And Kishi also suggests that some of the cases were actually fabricated. There was no real basis for plagiarism in them, but they were trying to harass the upstart Nagoya publishers. It was competition they didn't want to have. So what we can see in this attack on Bunpo Soga is a kind of precedent for Masayoshi's criticism of the Hokusai manga 14 years later. However, there is no evidence that formal action was taken against Tohekido for the publication of the Hokusai manga. Now, perhaps Tohekido was able to publish Hokusai manga without being prosecuted because he co-published them with Shuseki Kaku Kadomaru Yakinsuke, a long-established Edo publisher. Nonetheless, as I say, Masayoshi still expressed strong criticism of Hokusai manga, accusing him of always imitating others, never creating anything new. Now, permit me at this point a short digression. Bunpo Soga and Bunpo Kanga are identical in size and format. They seem to be like a pair. And I often wondered why Bunpo Soga was published in Nagoya and Bunpo Kanga was published in Kyoto. Because of the campaign of harassment against Nagoya publishers for publishing Bunpo Soga, it may have appeared safer to publish for the Kyoto publisher to bring out the Bunpo Kanga, rather than for Fugetsudo to try to get involved in that same kind of problem again. This is just a thought about why two very similar books by the same artist ended up being published in different cities. And it also explains to us now why Fugetsudo so early gave over the blocks that book and stopped selling it. that's the end of my little digression, because that Bumpo in his books is one of my other interests. Okay, now, in 1814, when the first Hokusai manga volume was published, Eirakuya Toshiro advertised it as one of 3 new books in Hanshibon size. This is the advertisement. It appears in Megagafu, and I put that red box around these 3 books. They are Keisai Soga, Bumpo Soga, and Hokusai manga, and each, notice, are complete in 1 volume. Well, this is very interesting reading from so Keisai Soga was illustrated by Kitao or Keisai Masayoshi himself. Bumpo Soga, as you know, was illustrated by Kawamura Bumpo, first published in 1800, but this is coming out in 1814 as a fresh book. Yeah. And it's also the book that Masayoshi's publishers sought to suppress. And then we have, of course, Hokusai manga, which was illustrated by Hokusai, criticized by Masayoshi for not being original. It's a very curious grouping of books here. Who knows what the politics were behind the publication of these 3 books that really have a rather contentious history with one another? But all I can do is point this out, and I have no explanation. There's lots of things about publishing in the Edo period that we really would love to know more about, but the archives aren't there for us to explore. The correspondence isn't there. Well, now, enough of my talking about the sources for Hokusai's general page layouts in the manga, which was such an important book. I would now like to look at some specific titles to see what Hokusai's sources might have been for them. There are Fugaku Hyake, the 100 Views of Fuji, the Hokusai Gafu, which was in 3 volumes, Eihon Toshisen Gogun Zeko, which was published in 2 volumes. And then I'm going to look briefly at 2 Yomihon on Chinese theme, Shinpansui Gogaden, and Eihon Kanso Gundan. And I'm going to end with Hokusai's very last book, Eihon Sai Shikitsu. Okay, now, 100 Views of Fuji. Books devoted entirely to images of Mount Fuji were not unknown. For example, there is Sanso Shinkei, illustrated by Oishi Shuga, which contained 35 images of Fuji in different kinds of weather. This was published in 1822. It's a very interesting, very faint book. It's almost dreamlike, the images of Fuji presented in it. The next year, Hokusai himself included a sequence of 8 images of Fuji in his Imayo Kisero Hinagata, his design book for comb makers, comb and pipe makers. And of course, there was Hokusai's own series, 36 Views of Fuji, which was actually 46 prints. Yeah, 46 prints. It's possible that the popularity of Fugaku Sanjuroke encouraged Hokusai and his publisher to undertake a book devoted entirely to Fuji. But of course, there was Kawamura Minsetsu's Hyaku Fuji, which presents a clear precedent for 100 images of Fuji. And this book was published in 1777. So that's 50-some years before the decision to produce Fugaku Hyake. It was published in Edo by Nishimura Genroku, and there were co-publishers in Kyoto and Osaka, as you can see here in the colophon to that book. Hyaku Fuji was a popular book. It was published in numerous editions, each with different covers and printed on slightly different sizes of paper, as you can see in these 4 volumes. They're all different from the other. Its popularity, as an indication of it, is that the Koten Seki Sogo Mokuroku lists 31 institutional copies in Japan. Now, that is a very high number when you're doing searches in that catalog. Now, so Hyaku Fuji provides an example of a commercially successful book that consisted of 100 views of Fuji. And so it was not only the idea of this book with 100 images of Fuji in it, but when we look more closely, we find that there were some designs that provided Hokusai with starting points for his designs in 100 views. But before I discuss those, I would like to compare the 2 books. So here we have Hyaku Fuji is in Ohon size, and Fugaku Hyake is in Hanshibon size. Hyakufuji is in 4 volumes. Fugaku Hyake is in 3 volumes. Hyakufuji was printed in line only. Fugaku Hyake was printed in line with shades of gray. In Hyakufuji, the views of Fuji are from specific, exact named locations. Most of the images in Fugaku Hyake present idealized, abstract views of the mountain, as you can see in this comparison here. The views in Hyakufuji are organized by location, very systematically in the book. Each volume is devoted to views of the mountain from a specific region, direction, angle, if you will. So volume 1, views of Fuji from the city of Edo. Volume 2 is Ura Fuji, back views of Fuji from Musashi, Sagami, Kai, and Suruga. Volume 3 is views of Fuji from the Tokaido. It's an interesting take there. And volume 4 is views of Fuji from famous places in various provinces. Fugaku Hyake is not organized in such a systematic way at all. And in Hyakufuji, we get short poetic text in the image field. Fugaku Hyake just has a short label in each image field. Hyakufuji presents broad landscape vistas without significant foreground figures. In Hokusai's book, figures appear prominently in 78 of the 100 views. Because the lively foreground figures are so prominent in Fugaku Hyake, you have workmen in it, you have porters, you have travelers, you have all sorts of things in it. It led the Englishman Lawrence Oliphant, one of the first Europeans to encounter the book and to reproduce images from it in a Western publication, to describe it as a book illustrative of the various trades in Japan. He didn't know the title of the book, he didn't know who the author was. Looking at it, he said, oh, well, it's about the trades of Japan. Now, Hyakufuji itself is mentioned in the preface to the 3rd volume of Fugaku Hyake. The author of the preface, an otherwise unknown Rozan Ko, wrote, while Minsetsu's 100 views of Mount Fuji are orthodox, those of Hokusai are eccentric. That's an interesting thing to think about, but we'll leave that for the moment. Now let's look at some of the images in Hyakufuji that caught Hokusai's eye. I begin with Minsetsu and Hokusai's rendering of the same view, which we have here before, as Taisekiji. Now, there's a poem, it says, amidst the light rain, Fuji emerges reminiscent of the birth of Saka. Now, these are very approximate translations of the poems. As I say, this is all preliminary, and I thank Matsuba Ryoko for transcribing and suggesting the meanings of the poems. But she's not at all responsible for what I may have done in mashing them up. Okay, so there's a general similarity between the two images. However, I think that the image on the right was actually the inspiration for Hokusai's Fuji Among the Pine Trees, where he's taken Minsetsu's design and added figures to it. And it's just occurred to me that there was another book of landscapes for which Hokusai was commissioned to insert figures. But as I say, this is work in progress, but the human element was very important for him. Okay. And certainly Minsetsu's equivalent, Fuji Among the Pines, was not an inspiration for Hokusai. I think the one on the right, I think that's probably the worst designs in Minsetsu's book. There we go again. Okay, now this design, Fuji Under a Bridge, has the poem Viewing Fuji with Joy from the Cool Shade Beneath the Bridge. There we are. So what does Hokusai do with this? It's actually one of the wittiest designs in Fugaku Hyake. It's Fuji of 7 bridges in one glance. And in case you're wondering, there are the 7 bridges for you. What a difference. Bringing humor to it, introducing these human figures. So a pretty empty starting point on the right, but nonetheless, I think, that triggered something in Hokusai's mind, and he came up with what we see on the left. And a delightful example of how Hokusai developed a beautiful design out of something that's rather confusing in Minsetsu's book is if we compare this image with a willow embankment in Fuji. And clearly what Hokusai did was he took that bottom left part of the double page spread and used it as the inspiration for his. Of course, he substituted willow trees for the pine trees. And here in Minsetsu, we do have figures, but Hokusai has given them even more animation, and he's made it a more coherent and powerful design. But I do think, again, that as he was leafing through Minsetsu, his mind would have been registering, oh, yeah, well, through trees like that might work, and then develop them in his own way. And then finally, we have the Fuji through a window. And the poem in the Minsetsu says, geese inscribe their path in the sky with Fuji framed in the window's view. Well, quite interesting. Minsetsu doesn't show us the geese. Hokusai, I think this is sort of proof that Hokusai knew this because he's put birds into the inscribed across the sky there. It's almost like he's saying, Minsetsu didn't really finish it, let me finish it and do what he was implying in his. And so we get the figure there. Is he stretching with delight? And he's got Fuji in front of him, and the line of the birds are going across it. Now, I think we could say that Hokusai doesn't need poems to enhance our appreciation of his images. The human figures he incorporated into most of his designs provide us with commentaries on or reactions to the views of the mountain. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to the influence of Nihon Sankai Meizan Zue of 1754 on the Hokusai Gafu. Now, the 3-volume Hokusai Gafu has a very, very complicated publishing history. Hokusai Gafu was printed from blocks originally cut for 2 Ohan-sized books, Hokusai Gashiki and Hokusai Soga. Those books were first published in 1819 and 1820, respectively. By the late 1820s, Eidakuya Toshiro acquired the blocks for those 2 books from the original publishers. He had them cut down from Ohon to Hanshibon size, and he modified the designs where that was necessary or possible. And he also commissioned Hokusai to provide further designs to fill 3 Hanshibon volumes of this planned Hokusai Gafu book. The 3 volumes were published over nearly 20 years, from the early 1830s to 1849. And why that was happening is a whole other story, but we'll leave that now. But here is a delightful example of the way they had to modify the designs. It's quite drastic what had to be done. And I particularly like what happened to this figure on the left, so that he didn't lose his nose. We actually have his nose and forehead going into the hashira, as well as the end of his sword. And then we can also see that, that the moon, the sky has been brought down and we've lost the inscription. So we've lost the space also below the figures and on the right. It's a bit more cramped. Now, recently, I attended remotely a workshop on Setsuyoshu that was held in Frankfurt. And one of the speakers showed images from Nihon Sankai Meizan Zue. And I was surprised to find that it contained the inspiration for a sequence of detailed, action-filled images of whaling that Hokusai had created specifically for Hokusai Gafu. Here are the images Hokusai created for Hokusai Gafu first. They begin on the left. There's the lookout who's signaling that he can see whales. Then we suddenly see this. What's going on? These men are hauling in a great rope. And then we turn to the next page and we see that a whale that had been killed by the men in the boats was being dragged to the shore. Well, here's the treatment of the book in the earlier Nihon Sankai Meisanzue. The lookout, and then he spread out over 4 sheets what the earlier book did in 1.5 sheets of the hauling in of the whale. But you can see that has to be the direct inspiration for what Hokusai did in Hokusai Gafu. And here we can compare the two again. We can see once again how much more dynamic Hokusai's rendering of the scenes appear, how brilliantly he reimagined his sources while remaining true to the details that were contained in them. I will now turn briefly to 2 Yomihon that were illustrated by Hokusai, the Shunpansuiko Ehon and the Ehon Kanso Gundan. These were, the first was published between about 1805, 1808 and the early 1830s, and the second one was done in the 1840s. So these span most of the last part of Hokusai's life. Now, I referred in the past to the China Hokusai depicts in his Yomihon and also in his school texts like the Ehon Shukyo, the Kobun Kokyo, or the Senjimon, or the images in his anthologies of Chinese poetry or warrior books as a virtual China. He created a virtual China. He obviously couldn't go there. He could only know it from objects brought in from China and from the illustrations in books, both books imported from China and images that had been imagined by his Japanese predecessors, especially Tachibana Morikuni. Now, when I consulted facsimiles of Chinese books, and I have to admit that I've had very little hands-on experience of actual Chinese books. They're so much more difficult to come by than Japanese illustrated books. My first discovery in looking for sources for Hokusai was very exciting. It was this Suikoden concordance. Concordance is a new word. This is what looks on the right to me as a Chinese model for Hokusai's rendering of a central scene in the Suikoden. When the hero Sungjiang inscribes a poem on the wall of a restaurant in Zhangzhou, and he left the poem there, and it was read as being seditious and then being jailed and all sorts of complications in the plot. But if you look closely, you can see a whole series of concordances there, or parallels. You can see the cloud in the Chinese original has been turned into a banner by Hokusai, and the rest are more obvious. So I was delighted. I was fantastic. I have not made another match as good as this one. But as I said, this is work in progress. But then what I realized was that I should be thinking more in terms of the ambience that he was borrowing. Sometimes he was borrowing the specifics of a scene, but other times he was taking on things, as you see, like the rocks in the foreground, the balustrade, draperies, and using them as props in his own virtual China. And then there were also the action scenes. And for these, we have Hokusai is in the top center. And then we have Morikuni at the bottom. And then on either side, we have Chinese examples. And you can see immediately the cohesion, the dynamism of Hokusai's depiction. At the same time, there's his debt to these images by his predecessors. Now, but there's more work to be done here, and I am looking forward to what I'm likely to come up with. Now, I'd like to move on to Tachibana Sekiho's illustrations from Toshisen Ehon Shohen, which was published in 1788, and Hokusai's images in Ehon Toshisen Gokun Zeku. Now, it happens that the Shohen of Toshisen Ehon consisted of all the Gokun Zeku poems in the anthology of Tang poetry. And the Ehon Toshisen was a major publishing event. It was in 7 parts. Each part consisted of 5 volumes. So Sekiho did the first part in 1788. Hokusai did the 6th and 7th parts, 10 volumes, in the mid to late 1830s. So there was a long span. There were 5 artists who did the first, 5 artists who did the first 5 parts, each of 5 volumes. Then Hokusai did the 6th and 7th himself. Now, what appears to have happened was that, well, first of all, Ehon Toshisen Gogunzeku is a book that was published in Tokyo in 1880 using the block-ready drawings Hokusai had created in the 1830s. And in the 20th century, Western collectors and scholars paid very little attention to it. And in 2019, I spoke in detail about that book at a seminar here. Now, I believe that Hokusai was commissioned to create the block-ready drawings for this book after he had completed his block-ready drawings from parts 6 and 7 of the Toshisen Ehon. And after those volumes appeared, the publisher, Kobayashi Shinbei, who had published the Toshisen Ehon Shohen in 1788, decided that it was time to refresh that volume, as it were, to commission Hokusai to illustrate them on the basis of the success, the popularity of the 2 hen he'd already done of for him of the Toshisen Ehon. And so it was more dynamic. Hokusai would be more exciting, more dynamic, more saleable. Hokusai produced the block-ready drawings, but for some reason, Kobayashi Shinbei could never proceed with the publication of the book. Now, late 30s into the early 1840s was a time of economic and social disruption in Japan. And it's possible at that point that they simply had to put the material aside. It was not until 1879 that they had the block-ready drawings used to cut blocks and then to print the book, which was then offered for sale in 1880. It's still a genuinely Hokusai book. Now, I looked at what Sekiho had done, and I quickly discovered that Hokusai drew inspiration for many of his illustrations directly from Sekiho's designs. Now, I presented some of these in 2019, but I think you won't mind if we look at them again. And these will be fresh to some of them. So here's a poem by Li Bai. The birds fly off into the Empyrean. A solitary cloud idly passes by, exchanging glances. We 2 aren't bored, just me and Mount Jingting. And we have virtual mirror image in the Hokusai of the Sekiho composition. Except Hokusai, in this case, has omitted the birds. For those of you out there, I have colleagues in the room with me, and I'm sort of pacing my slides on the degree of interest they're showing in looking at the images. Okay, let's go to the next poem. Sitting alone in a dense, silent bamboo grove, playing the chin, repeatedly chanting, in this deep wood unknown to men, the bright moon comes to illuminate me. And you can barely see the moon in the Sekiho. Where's my, there we are, cursor, right there. There's a little moon there. But all the essentials of the Sekiho image were taken over by Hokusai. Okay. And then this one's fun. Having lost my coral riding weed, my arrogant horse refuses to go. I snap a switch from a willow tree. On a spring day, the roadside has its delights. But the delights of the roadside refer to a brothel. And in the Sekiho, it's quite obvious what's going on because we see the ladies in the brothel giggling because he'd forgotten his riding crop, his expensive riding crop. He's quite a dandy in the brothel, and his horse won't follow his commands without it. So he's breaking the branch off the willow tree. Now, if we look at Hokusai, we have the young man breaking a branch of the willow tree, a stubborn horse. And if you look way in the distance here, where's my cursor? Can you see there? That's the brothel, and there are tiny figures on the balcony, just as we have here, but turned into a broad vision with a livelier and in some ways more realistic horse. This looks like a prancing carousel horse more than anything else. And then we can go on to this so very close, but I fear the wind and rain will prevent me from ascending Lushan. I do doubt if in the those Misty Caves there are still 6 dynasty monks. Okay. And I don't need to provide you with a commentary on this. I think it's self-evident how Hokusai took and vivified the rather stiff drawing that the precedent that Sekiho provided. And then finally, against the blue of the river, the birds so intensely white, against the green of the hills, the flowers about to ignite. This spring is no sooner seen than gone, which will be the year of my homecoming. Now, it's a dramatic poem, it's punch to it. I always think in these books that the poem provides the color that's missing from the line-only illustrations. Now, what interests me here is the poem does not mention a bridge, does not mention that the poet is viewing this scene from a bridge, nor that he has his young boy servant with him. But if we look in the far distance of Hokusai's image up there in the top left, lo and behold, there's the bridge with the poetic, the speaker and the boy following him. But Hokusai has turned it into this extraordinary image that plays on the key visual elements of the poem, the birds against the water and the brilliant colors of the flowers against the hillside. He was an alchemist. Now, I'd like to conclude with Ehon Saishikitsu and Gokan. Okay. Now, Ehon Saishikitsu was Hokusai's final book. In it, he sought to record all that he knew about painting. And this has recently been published in English in a translation by Matsumoto Yoko in a wonderful series. I recommend it to you. It's fascinating. She's taken a number of texts from Hokusai's books in which he talks about the art of painting. But the key texts come from Ehon Saishikitsu. The book was intended to be in 4 Chuhon volumes. Hokusai only lived long enough to prepare the first 2 of these 4 for publication. As Hokusai wrote in his postscript to the first volume, this book is in smaller format to make it affordable. It was issued in Chuhon size, which is even smaller than Hanshiban, meaning that it was significantly less expensive to produce. And it was also printed in line only from just the key block. Whereas for the manga, you had a pink and a gray block to print from. In Mount and 100 Views of Fuji, you had a number of gray blocks that were used, which of course adds significantly to the cost of production. But this book entirely in key block. In addition, Hokusai adopted a format that was used in Gokan. If we look here, Gokan were the most affordable of all commercially produced books in the 19th century for a mass market. And their outstanding feature is the close integration of dense text with images on every page. So above we see 3 spreads from Nissimurasaki Nakagenji, the bestseller of the 19th century, and below 3 spreads from Ehon Saishikitsu. So this close integration of text and image meant that you could reduce the page count, and as a result, the overall cost of the book. I think this was a highly innovative design for a painting manual. Hokusai exploited the Gokan format to create an informative book that could reach a very wide audience. And there you can see again how he's combined the text and image. Now, in conclusion, Hokusai has a reputation for his landscapes. However, his main interest, at least in his book illustrations, was with the expressive rendering of the human figure. The appeal of his figures was so great that he charged publishers in some cases by the number of figures he included in his block-ready drawings. As we saw in the selection of images from Fugaku Hyake, Hokusai enhanced the viewer's appreciation of the landscapes through his human figures. his human figures providing gloss on the landscape in which they appear. They inject it with energy that might otherwise be lacking. Throughout his long career, Hokusai absorbed a vast array of images created by other artists. That is part of being an artist, constantly seeing and absorbing images and motifs. All that is seen by a creative mind is internalized and then transmuted through the creative process. As we have seen this evening, Hokusai could take very ordinary images he encountered in books by others and use them in two ways. The first way he used images was to learn about a process, an activity, object, or place he did not know firsthand. He grasped the technical details from other images. This might involve the nature of Chinese armor or how whales were hunted, just about anything else. The second way Hokusai used images was to provide himself with the germ of an idea for a composition. The images he saw provided him with a starting point from which he could create a fresh and exciting image that was entirely his own. The examples I have shown you this evening make this point very powerfully. Hokusai was not afraid to borrow, even, if you will, to steal, because what he produced far exceeded the quality of what he was taking. He knew how good he was. Some of Hokusai's fellow artists, like Masayoshi, may have been critical of him, but as Pablo Picasso once said, good artists copy, great artists steal. Hokusai was a lot more than a thief. He was an alchemist who could turn lead into gold. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tinios. It was a fascinating talk. I always enjoy these sort of book talks because they're just so rich in details. And, even for someone who's not really that expert in books, even just to see firsthand, oh, this is what a Gokon looks like. And this is what, as well as, I'll make just another few very short remarks, and then we can move into Q&A. But just to say a couple more things, maybe it's a very, very fine detail, but I noticed in the, I apologize if I get the names wrong, but in the book published by Fugetsu Do.
Yeah, the Hokusai Bunpo Soka.
Right. He identifies himself as being from Nagoya with the phrase, I think it's Bishu or Oshu, Oshu, using the O from Owari. But then Eirakuya takes the Wari from Owari and writes, Hari, what's that, Chofu. So I'm not sure if there's really anything to read into that, but just sort of the depths of connoissorial knowledge that can come out of this. Sometimes it's Meiyo using the Na from Nagoya, but sometimes it's Chofu. And just another thing also in my own research on books and paintings about the Ryukyu embassies, there's quite a few Nagoya books that come out of that. Enkoan, Otagiri Shunko books from Nagoya. And I never really thought that deeply, or never happened upon the research, what is going on with the Nagoya publishing industry as compared to or in relation to Edo, Osaka, Kyoto, right? And so we've learned tonight a little bit about sort of the politics there. I feel like it's probably it's separate in a certain sense, the three cities plus Nagoya, and sort of what is the relationship there. So in any case, I will stop talking, and if anyone has any questions, please use the raise hand function in the Zoom, or you can type in the chat box.
Should I stop sharing?
Oh, if you'd like, yeah, sure.
So now we go back to just
like this. Okay. So if anyone has any questions. I also thought it was very interesting to see the mustard seed manual and sort of the comparison. Masayoshi is accusing Hokusai of stealing the format.
When he stole it himself.
When in fact, I think
I shouldn't have said stole it, yeah, but
Wow.
yeah.
But I think there's also a conversation to be had about, sort of what's traditional or what becomes traditional versus, being, I don't know, which I guess just goes back to how we interpret it as art historians, maybe. I'm not really sure. Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, maybe.
Well, I need to look further because when I make certain statements, you think, I'm sure there are examples that I've missed. But as I say, this is work in progress.
Sure.
And certainly because Masayoshi made these bold statements, he's a very good starting point in looking at this and considering what was going on. But what amazes me is that the Hokusai manga, which was issued as a standalone volume, turned out such a hit. So that 9 more volumes were produced between 1815 and 1819. So there were 10 by 1819, 10 manga volumes. And at the same time, Hokusai published at least another 10 amazing illustrated books. And then after a rest of a few years, Tohekido and his colleagues in Edo decided they'd do another 10. And they got through 11 and 12, and then Tempo Crisis intervened. And it wasn't until the 1850s that you got, early 1850s, that you got 13 and 14, which were maybe from a set of block ready drawings, maybe for volume 13, maybe not, maybe just preliminary sketches that were realized by one of his pupils. We don't know, but they're not quite what the others give us. And then you got the total fabrication, volume 15, in 1878. And I've just written a short piece for the Bodleian Library Journal, because at the Bodleian, they have 3 fukuro wrappers for the manga of the 1878 edition. And each contains 5 volumes. And I suspect that Tohekido decided he needed a 15th volume so he could sell it neatly in 3 bundles of 5 volumes. And the 15th volume was, he's got this totally bogus preface that he wrote, and he didn't find drawings at the bottom of the trunk and all the rest of it. He actually took another book that Hokusai had published in 1818, which he himself or his predecessor had published in 1858. And then he thought 20 years later, it would be very safe to take the designs in there, disassemble them and rearrange them and say they were fresh designs for manga 15. But, there was this, they sold. And sorry, I'm going on. Has anybody got questions to interrupt me on this? Because I could go on for the rest of the evening. But one last thing, on the title page, as it were, of volume 15, there's a monkey. It's published in the year of the monkey, holding up a hanging scroll that says Hokusai manga Jukohen. Okay, it's great. It's properly silk mounted, the inscription. And in the decorative bands of silk at the top and the bottom, the motif is coins. Yeah. And to me, this is the firm saying, this is what made us all our money. That they would frame the title Hokusai manga with coins. So he wasn't subtle about it.
Okay, so no. So we have a question in the chat from Hannah Osborne from UEA.
Sure.
So she says, what interested me was that Hokusai's Fuji is so narrow compared to others, and presumably distorts the proportions of the actual Fuji. Is there any reasons for this?
He certainly does. I think it's just stylistically, that's what he preferred, to give it that very elegant, unrealistic peak. Yeah. I noted it. I didn't mention it, but it was his preference. Yeah.
I noticed also when you were showing some of the images of Fuji, I don't remember which, but I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like Fuji is very often depicted with 3 little bumps at the top.
Little bump, yes.
And, just I mean, I don't know if this is really that interesting of a question, but just I was looking at it, I was like, oh, I wonder if they always make sure to have 3 bumps. If that's like a very, important part of.
Well, this might be a fun thing to look at various renditions of Fuji, to see how they treat the peak of the mountain.
Right.
And all. I mean, I think the simplest ones give you those 3 things on it and down. The elegant, narrow Fuji that Hokusai gives us is, I think it's his trademark.
Thank you, Hannah. Any other questions from anyone? 他の質問いかがでしょうか?
Well, should we say goodnight?
I mean, let's see. Hokusai's Toshi-sen uses perspective that we're familiar with today. For example, putting the bridge and the figures far in the back.
Yes.
Is this something that he created, or were there precedents before him in Japan?
Oh gosh. Hiroshige was using perspective as well, and diminishing figures in the distance. It was there, and they had the imported Dutch prints and manuals. And in one of the manga volumes, Hokusai actually has an image that replicates single point, vanishing point perspective. It's got buildings like a street, figures in it. So they were certainly aware of that, and to create distant, small figures. I find that fascinating, though. The reduction, the degree of reduction of the figures in that is extreme.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I would have noticed them if you hadn't pointed it out, but it's really something. In a way that
if we didn't look at the Sekiho, well, okay, yeah, where did that come from?
why the figures? Yeah, right. I forget what year, or sort of even roughly what year the ukiyo first appear, right? Because you have some version of
they were around, so well before, from the 18th century. So and he was aware of it, and he played with them.
Suzuki says, do you have a question?
Hi, Ellis. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Hi.
I have a question. So about Kitao's accusation about stealing, is there any Hokusai's reaction or comments or a reply about this?
Unfortunately not. I mean, we don't have the archives. The few letters of Hokusai's that survive, some of them give us such rich information, like when he was complaining about the block cutters. And he must have said something about Masayoshi, but I don't know. I've never seen anything of it. And Ijima doesn't. I don't think this. So anyway, all I know is there was that accusation that he made.
Because I thought it's how conscious he remake or recreate the scene as he did.
Well, can I just say that that Masayoshi and Hokusai both illustrated Ehon Kokyo, and Yamamoto Yoshitaka has written an article for it in the late Hokusai volume of the British Museum, and he points out that Hokusai avoided replicating the scenes that Masayoshi had done. So maybe there was a little bit of tenderness there and a wariness, but So because of our incomplete record, there's a lot of juicy details that are missing.
Right. But the comparison you really made, it was really made the point. I mean, just so fascinating.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for attending. Yes.
Thank you, Keiko. And actually related to that, I'm sure you said it in the talk, but I kind of missed it. Where does Masayoshi make this accusation? Is it in letters?
No, it was recorded.
published
Yeah,
somewhere.
it's recorded by another. In the Kansei, is it something Iji? So it's a secondhand reporting, he said.
In a manuscript text or in a published.
Originally manuscript text has been published. Yeah.
Interesting.
Or
yeah. So I mean, he's not making the accusation sort of in the preface of a book that's being distributed out.
No, the passage when Yamamoto Ishitaka wrote up the Kogyo, the classical piety, he discussed that quote he used there to set the context for this Hokusai Masayoshi, what was going on between the two books. Yeah.
So we have another question from UEA, which is that Hokusai seemingly renders the perspectives of many images and changes their focus on different things, right? As opposed to the original version. So would you say that this was his main focus in creating his own art?
What struck me most, yes, he was taking maybe a fresh angle, but some of them it's quite exact. Like the flipping of the Tang poetry images that I showed you, or coming up over the embankment. So he's not always doing a very different take, but what he's doing is with the figures, and he's really animating the scenes with the human figures that he puts in them. So if anything, what struck me most as I was looking at these is how he would insert figures where his model may not have had any at all.
And that makes a huge difference, really.
Yeah.
Sort of dynamism or the feeling of the images.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. じゃあ、他のどなたかいかがでしょうか？他の質問。
Can I have a question?
Okay. じゃあ、西林先生お願いします。
I'm Takahiro Nishibayashi. Thank you for your amazing presentation. It's very clear for me Hokusai manga's origin. Today's presentation showed me the influence from Kaishien Garden to Kitao Masayoshi, and great influence from Masayoshi to Hokusai manga, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So it's very clear Hokusai manga's origin. Chinese prints are very important for Hokusai's book. I think so too. Thank you very much. I have one question. In recently, Otsuka Eiji at Nishibunken Institute, he said that for Hokusai Ryakuga's another influence, 画面共有して大丈夫でしょうか? Can I have a question?
What?
Okay. Just going to share.
Yeah. Oh yes. Oh yes. Yeah. We see Masayoshi's.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then we have Hokusai's.
Yes. So he said influence from Dutch prints to Hokusai Ryakuga, like this research. Tsuji sensei said too. Tsuji sensei focused on Dutch prints by like this fin de passé, or like this. Yes. So could you tell me, do you think about influence from Dutch prints to Hokusai's book?
Oh, definitely. Yes. There's that's another strand. Yes, absolutely. There were limits to what I was doing tonight, but these are wonderful. Yeah. But as I say, he was taking in things all the time. And I've seen this when I've spoken to artists too, and they're saying, we're talking about how they see the world, and they're constantly they see a motif here or a sort of grouping of figures that somehow sticks in their head, and then they can recall it. And it can either be in another work of art or in life itself. And so Hokusai was able to see these things and process them and give them back to us. And I think you'll agree in the Ryakugashiki books, what Hokusai is doing is much more interesting than his Dutch models, his European models. There's much more life in them. They're much more interesting. The prototypes to me are academic. They're kind of dull. They don't have the life force that was praised by Japanese critics and of the Edo period. So thank you very much for contributing those to us tonight, because they're a great set of images. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nishibayashi-sensei.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, those are fantastic to see. And I'm kind of tempted to comment on the images that he just showed from Morishima Churio, but obviously those weren't in your presentation, so maybe we'll leave it aside.
I wish they were.
I mean, these stick figures, I haven't seen that many Edo period books nearly as much as you have, but I was just surprised to see those. The one Morishima Churio book that I've looked at is Ryukyu Banashi, right, which is a whole separate sort of, it's about Ryukyu, whereas this book is about the Dutch. So of course he's copying models of how the Dutch depicted things, something like that. So it's a whole other conversation. But in any case, so we have another question from UEA about the last work, Ehon Saishiki Tsu. I thought Saishiki means colorful, but it seems to only have lines.
Yes. This is that the question?
They wrote quite a bit, so I'll read it out.
Read it out first, yes.
So what does Saishiki mean here? But it's also so dense with text. Seeing Hokusai's works from the earlier ones up to Saishiki Tsu, it seems his works are getting denser and denser. In Chinese painting, there's a lot of white space, and I saw a lot of white space in white space in his previous works, but at some point it seems that he had many details in his drawings, and the white space was no longer dominant. So what do you think about that?
Well,
also, was there a change after Hokusai in the perception of, that's a separate question.
Okay, fine. Yeah, it's a good question to clarify what Ehon Saishiki Tsu is about. It is about painting in color. So the paradox is it's being issued in line only, but it's all about color. And this comes across in Matsubara Yoko's translation, where he's talking about the way you layer pigments to get particular effects that he achieved in his paintings. It's an excruciatingly detailed account of what to do, and it's incomplete. We just have the 2 volumes. So yes, but it would not have been affordable if it was printed in anything approaching the colors that he wanted. And it would have been virtually impossible to achieve in print the effects that he was describing that you would achieve with your brush. When he's talking about 8, 9, 10 applications of increasingly dense pigment to give a superb gradation to a feather, to a petal on it. And I think it's wrong to say that this represents a new kind of density in what he's doing, because he's doing something that he'd never done before, which was to express all that he knew about painting for posterity. He was about 88 at this point, and he wanted to record it all, and he did not manage to finish the book. In Boston recently, they've discovered a manuscript dated, I believe, 1855. I think Ryoko can tell us more about this, which appears to be part, at least, of the text that would have been published in volumes 3 and 4 of Ehon Saishiki Tsu. But for me, what is remarkable is that it takes on the Gokan format in order to keep the price down, in order to allow as many people as possible to learn from it. But my goodness, if you wanted to paint what he's telling you to do, you'd have to have a lot of experience, and you'd have to have access to a lot of expensive pigments and materials to do it. But he wanted that down for posterity.
This may be sort of a pretty basic comment, but I've always thought it sort of interesting that gap, that dynamic between all of these painting manuals published in black and white, right? As cheap as possible. Well, at least some of them are. And trying to replicate paintings in print, but then I mean, just to mention also, this past weekend I happened to pass by the Ota Museum in Tokyo, in Harajuku, and they have up that famous painting by Katsushika Oi, the Night in the Yoshiwara, as well as a whole bunch of Hokusai paintings and other paintings. And just as you described, of course, they're so rich in color and sort of careful layering of pigments and all this kind of stuff. So it's, I don't know what to say. It's just interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Read the text, and it'll describe how to paint these things that we can only show you a very basic version of in the book.
In the book itself, yeah. I'll show you the outline. Some of the black and white drawings actually do show this. Here's how your brushstrokes go, your layers, how far they should come out. About replicating paintings in books, a lot of the gafu, the painting manuals of the Maruyama Shijo school, for example, are replicating paintings that were done on paper, that were done in sumi with light washes. So they are quite a good facsimile of the painted scroll. So like with Bumbo's books, if you saw a painting by Bumbo on silk, it's likely to have much more solid, more saturated colors. It's a whole other world that doesn't appear in his painting manuals.
I see.
Yes. Okay, so that's what kinds of paintings are being presented, what techniques are being promoted in a particular book. So I think Hokusai is doing something quite different here in doing the full color painting and trying to express it through line only and text, rich text. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have another question. Was there a change after Hokusai in the perception of art and manga among other artists?
In Japan, I can't say anything. In Europe, it was seismic, the arrival of the manga. They just went mad when these books started arriving. And they were there quite early. In 1867, the Bakufu, 1867, that's right, the year before, they participated in the Universal Exposition in Paris. And they sent books. Among the books were the Hokusai manga and the Hokusai gafu. So they were becoming available to Europeans, and the impact was, as I say, enormous. But that's another story as to how the French and others responded to it. Yes.
But it's fascinating that these books, maybe we're drawing too harsh a dichotomy or something, but in undergrad art history classes or whatever it may be, we're taught Hokusai and all of the publishing, and not everything, but to a certain extent, this is popular art, this is common arts. So for the shogunate to pick that up and say this is Japanese art, this is representative.
Well, they were Japanese manufacturers. It was representing Japanese manufacturers. And I forget the exact statistics. They sent about 120 titles. And about 16 were dealing with art, and 4 of those 16 were by Hokusai, and no other artist was as fully represented as he was in this.
Yeah, as soon as you say manufacturers, that makes more sense, right? Because the whole kind of modern concept of arts versus crafts and high art was still very much its infancy, I suppose, in Japan at that time. Excellent. Well, so Hannah also adds that as a literature person, it's very interesting to see how art can similarly be considered through intertextual evolutions, right? By comparing different artists and different publications. It's fascinating. I mean, as you were also saying before, like sometimes it's just happening to come across the examples or not happening to come across them.
Yes.
It's fascinating when you do find them to see how they relate. And I'm just sort of talking, but I'm reminded of a talk you gave at some point. I apologize how many years ago, but maybe it was Hokusai Gafu. I don't really know which books are which, but I don't know that as well. But you gave a talk about a book in which it was either a pheasant or a phoenix had its head chopped off because the publisher was trying to reuse images.
That was the one image that could not be modified to fit into Hokusai Gafu.
So this is the same book with the moon that goes
over the moon goes over there, yes. And the pheasant's head would not only have had to go into the hashi to get around to the next page, but they weren't going to cut it off. So they had to jettison that one design. But it was the only design that could not be modified from the soga or the saishiki to go into the gafu.
Yeah, but being able to look at these comparisons and realize where they came from, it's fantastic. So. Well, we still have about 10 minutes left in the the main sort of general Q&A. So if anyone has any further questions, いかがでしょうか、皆様。
じゃあ、いいですか、質問。
お願いします。
すみません、先生もあるかもしれない。I have a quick question. When Hokusai drew from a prior work, did he copy the work side by side? Also, did Hokusai keep a book for reference? In other words, did he archive them? Because I know Hokusai moved the 90 times.
Yes.
Over 19 times. So
yeah.
I think it's possible to keep the books. How do you think?
I think he kept a lot in his head. And these are spread over a long period. I think in something like the Hongo Gunzeku, he had the Sekiho next to him when he was working them through. And I think the Minsetsu he would have had there. But some of the others are memories, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But also, you know, when he did the whaling sequence, he would have been looking back to the other book for reference for the details. So I think it's hard to say, but he, should we say, often had his model with him. It wasn't just a remembered motif, but he had that full composition that he was drawing on. But as you say rightly, I don't think he had a wonderful collection of sketchbooks, of model, things that he kept, funpon. They'd be lost, and he lost everything in fires at times as well. So I think once he finished the job, maybe he never looked at Minsetsu again. But and didn't need the book. But we can only speculate. But that's, I think, as you say, pointing out how many times he moved in his life, it's unlikely that he carried with him a large library of reference works.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Akama Sensei. So we'll go to Yano Sensei and then Matsuba Sensei.
Hello, Ellis. Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, there you are. There you. Yes, your voice is coming from here, and I have you here.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. A little bit some regular questions. So, and your talk including the Fukakyake, that is a landscape of Mount Fuji's. So, if you have any challenge, research challenge, using the geographical perspective, for example, using GIS, if you have, please let me know. Let me know.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Yano Sensei. All right. Ryoko?
Okay. Thank you so much, Ellis. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
yes.
thank you. Just for following Akama Sensei's question, because I wonder if probably a publisher could bring the resources to Hokusai, especially for the Toshisen, because both Sekiho's and Hokusai's Toshisen is published by Suzampo, I suppose, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So I think they more have archives. The publisher kept the archives from their collection, and when they have some idea with Hokusai to publish some newly published Toshisen, then they can bring the resources.
I think he could imagine, he would say, look, this is what Sekiho did 50 years ago. We'd like you to redo it for us. Yeah, so definitely it's a good, the thought that not that Hokusai had the books himself, but that the publisher, when he commissioned him, brought the books. Yes.
That's
Absolutely.
only
Absolutely, yes.
And also probably Suzampo and Tohekido, the two publishers, probably more like kind of bring some resource to him. Do you think?
Yeah. I wish we knew more. I wish we had more correspondence between Hokusai and his publishers, because that would answer so many of these questions for us. But we don't have them, so we have to look at the material, and we have to try to think without becoming too fanciful. We don't want to go off into the realms of pure fiction, but we have to try to draw reasonable conclusions from what the material tells us.
Yeah, but thank you so much
Okay.
for
Okay.
your presentation.
Oh, by the way, tell us the proper title of your book, of the Hokusai translations and the publishing.
Thank you for mentioning that. It is a mud about painting, but it's as you said, it's translation of Hokusai. Some of the preface and postscript and Hokusai shikitsu, but it's not only my effort really. So we had a study session with Leeds Mekan, with Akama sensei and other student and Kaneko-san, and also like Shimao sensei from Gakushuin and his student as well. So it's sort of like a group effort while we did a late Hokusai project at the Bush Museum.
But it's been published. We have these texts
It's been
now
published,
today,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
which is very important, which is good. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ryoko, and congratulations on the book. It's really exciting. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, if anyone has another question. Otherwise, maybe we'll move towards concluding today's seminar. All right, so thank you so much, Dr. Tinios. This is fascinating as always. I really appreciate it. Our next seminar will be 3 weeks from now on November 29th. Professor Taimon Screech from Nichi Bunken will share with us a talk under the title New Light on Nikko, Thoughts on the Dutch Lanterns at the Shrine Mausoleum of Tokugawa Ieyasu. So I hope to see many of you then. Thank you very much.